On George's banks our craft does lie, with both her anchors down. We've come to give the fish a try before we sail for Gloucester town. The steward says there's plenty of grub, and the floor is a good sea boat, so we can stand a pretty good drub and yet keep our craft afloat. And weather fair, we'll fish away, improving all our time, pulling the fish in day by day with nippers, hook, and line. If a storm comes on, all snug we'll make and pay out all our cable, and then be ready to give and take from old George's all we're able. We'll see that the cable doesn't chafe and keep a lookout bright. If she rides easy, we'll be safe, and the flora will come out right. So here's a good word for George's, her cod and halibut too. With anchors stout and cables strong, the business we'll pursue. That's a poem from Fishermen's Ballads and Songs of the Sea, published in 1874, right here in Gloucester by the Proctor Brothers. It's a book I've been living with for the last 2 years plus. Exploring pieces, there's 120 pieces of it, and I've been most interested in the pieces written by Gloucester fishermen and locals, such as that one written by Billy Mack. I found a William Mack in the city directory, and the Flora was a boat built in Essex in 1866. And I chose it to start because I think it's kind of a metaphor for what all this has been about for 5 years, which I've been very tangentially related to. It's very affirming, and it's aware. It's affirming of the purpose of fishing on George's Bank, which is very, very dangerous, but full awareness, but affirming the purpose with aware of the danger and the risks, and I think that's what a lot of your work has been about. So I'm going to segue from that to a song I wrote recently as part of the Gloucester Cultural Initiative event up in Lanesville. And doing this work for 2+ years, it's just led me to a lot of reflection on past resilience and future resilience and our place in it. So this is a song, I just need a note for myself. Looking out to sea, I see for 100 years of the Cape's history looking back at me. Looking out to sea, our town sent men down to the sea in ships, and they drowned in the sea in ships. Tens and tens and tens of men went down in the sea in ships, and again and again and again men went down. A whole town of men were drowned in the sea in ships, and the town living its fears, drowned in a sea of tears. Year after year after year, drowned in a sea of tears, and now we're here. What today is our fear? What brings us here? Is it climate calamity or calm equanimity? The greening of the earth or clam flats overrun by green crabs? A clam calamity as bellwether of bad weather? The sea is marching on the marshes, reducing their margins, incremental encroachment, incremental, detrimental. The sea advancing on the Martians, expanding its margins, knowing no boundaries, just going where it please. And the surf's steady moan and groan, its dash and crash, slosh and wash and rush on the shore. Fingers of foam grasping and clasping, creeping and seeping, wreaking slow havoc. Fingers of foam grabbing sand, clawing rock and cliff, feeling and stealing inland, finding firm ground to hide and wash away and stay. Is this another sea serpent? Another sea serpent come for Cape Ann? Coming for our harbor, our coves and wharves and homes? Or is this the gobbling old ghoul of George's, the great old ghoul of George's banks, not fed on fishermen anymore, still hungering for more? Boats and bones and souls now stalking our shores and at our door. Encouraged by carbon, our devil's bargain with carbon, CO2, 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 a great mob of molecules agitating the atmosphere, holding the heat, warming the world. And the H2O in ice and snow letting go to flow and flow and flow. Then all the glaciers gone. Water locked in ice released, all the water locked in ice released into the sea. We're now living in a sea change, living in the sea change of this time. Our innocence, the innocence of our earlier lives, now arrogance and indifference, or attuned and turned to make a difference. Can the anchors of our lives hold, the cables of our lives hold, the anchors of our hearts and homes hold, the cables of our community hold, hold. I'm now 70, in the late years of my life. I wonder what will this all be when I leave, after I flee this body and this earth. My spirit will be freed. Will I be in bliss, unaware of all of this? Or will I, hovering, still see from some astral galaxy and still be looking at the sea? Oh, what will it be, all this be, come the next century? Come the next century, what will it be to be looking out to sea? For now, for me, looking out to sea, the sea is looking back at me. Looking out to sea, the sea's looking back at me. The sea's looking back at me. The sea's looking back at me. See? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for centering us in the room today. Just a few words about Michael, for those of you who don't know him. He's a singer and song teacher of Celtic and maritime songs and ballads, and is a longtime resident of Cape Ann, blowing in from the Midwest 32 years ago. His Fisherman's Ballads project works with the 1874, as he mentioned, Gloucester publication, and a wide array of authors, including many who are local. He set the poetry of Cape Ann quarry workers to music and is doing the same with the works of fishermen, and he welcomes you to engage with his work. So thank you again, Michael. So my name is Valerie Nelson. I'm one of the leaders of the Cape Ann Climate Coalition, and most of you know Greg Fettersfield, formerly of Manchester and now with Town Green's March program. And we'd like to start off this day with a few introductory comments. In a way, how are we here at this very important day for you all as well? I'd like to direct you to this title of Rough Seas Ahead, which is what Michael is getting at is that we do know that storms are coming, waves are coming, there are dangers ahead. And then secondly, that this is about insights into Cape Ann's future. So let me give a little background and context. 3 years ago, Congress approved a grant for Cape Ann with the goal of, quote, expanding local capacity to manage extreme weather events. In our case, we know that would be a hurricane, which we've had historically, and one will come again. And at that time, we got that money because it was already known that the ability of any city or town to survive and come out of such a disaster, and I might add that it's not just a hurricane, but there are a bunch of man-made disasters as well that require the same capacities that we'll discuss all day. And those could be a closing of a manufacturing plant or another economic downturn, or in our case, a radical cut in federal and state funding that we rely on. And they depend on a strong, surviving and coming out of this in the way that we would like depends on a strong financial foundation and a resilient community of residents that are able to pull together in the interests of all and a strong partnership between local government and that community. So we've been exploring what that entails for Cape Ann. It's been with Harvard and Tulane professors, and at earlier times with UMass Boston, about our own unique vulnerabilities and possible ways that we can here expand and strengthen our local capacities and resilience. And we've learned a few things about what capacity means that you'll hear about all day. But I'd like to add a few context-setting notes that I think we here in the community have also learned. We've learned how difficult it is to imagine the future. It goes against every fiber of our being, even in our own lives. It's too scary. We might lose if others gain. So the best thing of all to do is avoid this future. And you can see it in even how we talk about very status quo, short term, let's do something about housing, but we're not facing up yet and imagining what our future could entail and strengthening our capacities. I would say there's more of a focus that there's been on alarmist anticipation of the wreckage of a hurricane, and that's not necessarily what really engages all of you. I think we're covering today other aspects of resilience that have to do with strengthening our communities and the way that our governments work with our communities collaboratively to often to consider very new ways of doing things that depart from the status quo, maybe changes required in regulations and funding and work of all of us more collaboratively. So we'll talk about some of those system shifts in landscape management, economies, and connections to each other. And I want to thank everyone here in the room. This is our invitations, tried to make this clear. Because we have a lot of very smart and very well-educated people who will speak to us, and yet we're the ones in the audience who will be left with the tasks of moving forward. And we're here to have substantial blocks of time in the agenda, if you look at it, for discussion with the audience, because we want to ask the question is, what have they presented? Does it resonate with us? Or did they get some things wrong? Or what does it mean for how we might mobilize? So I really very much appreciate that you're all here today, and a very diverse group as it is. There are, for information about prior projects, there are flyers in the back. We already have coffee and muffins for those of you who want to get up now, and we'll have Sugar Magnolia's lunch, and at that lunch period, feel free to talk to faculty and to each other, and then we'll reconvene again at, I guess, 1 o'clock, isn't it? Another thing I want to say that Michael alluded to is we've been learning a lot about who we are in this room this very day, and how it's embedded in the notion of good ancestors, which to some degree comes out of indigenous wisdom, but is far broader. And that means that you take seriously the lives of your ancestors as the fishermen, even in the 1800s, What lessons can they teach us? What do they tell us about who we are in this very present moment, in this room today? What are the ancestors of us telling us about this place that's so special? And then we must look forward to coming generations. It is time now for us here today to think about our children and our grandchildren and what is the world that we will leave behind for them, and have we prepared this place for the crises and challenges that will come. And one last thing, and I think maybe there are all these separate presentations of multiple dimensions during the day, but this event was not titled Rough Seas Ahead, which says it all, and then it was not said to be a plan for Cape Ann's future. There is no central plan. You're not here to learn what intelligent people want to tell you, because there is no plan anyway. This is such an uncertain and complex, wicked problem, some people say, that what we need to do is find our place in it, invent our new projects you'll hear about, ways to heal the ruptures and polarization in the community, and then each one of us in our own jobs, in the organizations we're in the staff positions we hold in government, and then building bridges amongst all of us and coming back to talking together about imagining Cape Ann's future. So we're all thrilled that we have a chance to come out of this with some real insights, and possibly you'll find individually and together some projects that can make a very big difference as we grapple with the rough seas ahead. So thank you for coming. And Greg.
All right, thank you, Valerie. I'll be very brief. This actually all started 5 years ago when Valerie Nelson and myself and Dick Prouty sat down. I think it was at Calais in Manchester. We had a lunch together, and we started talking about what can we do to start some dialogue, to start the thinking that is needed in the new ways of approaching problems as a region and as individuals and as community. So thanks to some hard work, Dick got us some initial money, and then Valerie was very bold and went after some additional monies, and lo and behold, we were able to assemble some dollars to help make this new partnership with Harvard through Charles and his team. And it's been an interesting ride, for sure. I will say that after almost 40 years of working in municipal government, I remain very bullish on local government and local community. Yeah, there's been a lot of downtimes and a lot of times when I say, what am I doing? I'm banging my head against the wall yet again. But you know what? That's how we operate. That's our democracy. We have differences of opinion. We struggle with coming to conclusions, but we do make conclusions and we do move forward. The arc does move forward. And it moves forward because of people like you care. You care, you come in, you engage, and you get involved, you learn, and we put together our heads and we come up with solutions. And I remain a firm believer in that, and I thank you for affirming my belief by showing up today. You're here, and we can make progress. I remain an optimist. Yes, there are challenges, but there's always been challenges, right? Human society has always faced significant challenges. And we have a big one, right? We have a big one in climate, but we can do this. We can do this. So thank you for coming. We have a great day of information and insights. I hope you'll continue to be engaged. I look forward to your thoughts and how we can better engage and how we can move communities forward. And that starts with all of you. So thank you for coming. I welcome Mayor Verga to the podium to give a few welcome words as well. Again, someone who has been in government for some 18 plus years as an elected official, and he's not going anywhere either. So, Greg, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Well, first of all, good morning to all of you, and thanks for being here, and thank you, Valerie and Greg, and everybody involved in putting this together today. Rough seas ahead, indeed. If you look around, I'm so glad we're here in this historic room, in this historic building, and you look around the perimeter here, and you see this wonderful exhibit by professional photographer and excuse me, City Councilor Jason Groh of these veterans from the Vietnam and Korean eras. So during the break, please look around and really see the great work he's done. And it's a great symbol of where we are today. They fought for our rights and for our way of life. And we today are in that fight, dealing with climate change. And it's a two-part fight. First is fighting climate change itself. And then the other part is the fight against the people who think it's baloney, the so-called climate change hoax, which is disturbing. And at best, they truly believe climate change is fake. At worst, they know it's real, but it's lining their pockets. And they don't care what's being left for our kids and our grandkids. So if we look at who's right and who's wrong down the road, if we're wrong, what do we get out of the deal? A cleaner environment, buildings built in smarter places that are more resilient. If they're wrong, it's game over. There is no going back. Michael sang about water released from ice. That's what we're looking at. It's sad that the focus is on permanent tax cuts for billionaires and less focus on reality. And Valerie and Greg talked about the grant that was 3 years ago in the making from NOAA. Today, no dice on that grant. Words like sustainability, climate change, any of those buzzwords have been stripped from federal websites. And if any words in grant applications like that, forget about it. It's really a sad situation. So rough seas ahead, indeed. And I hate to bring the room down, but that's just unfortunately where we are. And as we move forward, as Valerie said, there is no central plan. This is such a widespread problem, and without support from the federal government down, there's really not a lot that cities and towns can do to plan for what could be catastrophe. So with that uplifting note, I just want to welcome you all here, and this is an important day that we can not begin the fight, but continue the fight, because we have a lot more battles ahead, because I want my grandchildren to have a world that is recognizable to them, and one that has safe air to breathe, has a supply of food, and not the breadbasket of America dried out. So we each have to spread the word and try to get a little bit of reality into the minds of those who just would put their political views ahead of reality and what's best for the country, and indeed the world moving forward. So rough seas ahead, but I think together we can help smooth that out. So thank you all for being here.
Okay, as it says on the board, we welcome Charles Walheim to the podium here. Charles is head of the Office for Urbanization at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, has been a great partner over these past 5 years, working on different phases. Will you get into those phases, or do you want me to? I'll get into them. Okay, I'll let you get into those. He'll explain the different phases that we've been working on and how we have pulled together this incredible amount of information that becomes a tool for all of us to use. So, Charles, thank you.
Thanks so much, Greg, and thanks all of you for being here. Michael, that was an amazing opening. Thank you so much for your generosity. I mean, just Mayor Verga, everyone here, City of Gloucester, our friends at Town Green, Cape Ann Climate Coalition. I'm joined here from the Office of Urbanization by Keaton Bruce and Sarah Page, who have been key contributors to the project, as well as 6 academic advisors that we'll introduce in a couple of minutes. Maybe you could start the slides, thanks. In January of 2020, thanks. January 2020, I got a phone call in my office, which I rarely answer, And I happened to, I'm not sure why, I was, so motivated to pick up the phone. And on the other end of the line was a woman that I came to understand was Valerie Nelson. And she said, "Why aren't you folks at Harvard doing more work on Cape Ann?" And you might imagine I was underprepared for this question. I didn't say this out loud, but in my head I was thinking, where's Cape Ann? Where's Cape Ann? And I said, I don't know. Why are you calling? Over the course of the next several weeks, it became clear that Valerie and Dick Prouty and Greg Federspiel and their colleagues were quite serious about the kind of challenges that folks were thinking about up here. And in that context, we embarked upon what's now been a 5-year collaboration, among the most productive and really generative collaborations of my professional career. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And I just want to begin by reinforcing what's already been voiced by the mayor, by Valerie and Greg, which is that our role really is to try to bring best available literature, best practices from elsewhere around the region, around the country, and that the future of Cape Ann will be, decided by Cape Anners, right? The future of Cape Ann is here in this room. This is a remarkably resilient place. It is built literally on top of granite. It has been here for millennia. People have lived here for a very long time, and for the 400 years of colonial settlement, it's been remarkably resilient. And with the same sentiment that both Greg and Mayor Verga described, I remain absolutely bullish on the future of this place. We understand that there are challenges, and a part of our work is to help to think about those challenges, to try to describe them. So our group is a research group at the design school. So the design school are architects, planners, landscape architects, engineers. We think about ecology. And our work is to help communities think about change in the built and natural environments over time. Since 2020, we've been engaged in a range of different exercises through a process of scenario planning. And this scenario planning is informed by the best available meteorological advice, the best geological knowledge, but also a deep commitment to understanding and spending time in the place. We've had doctoral students live here for several months and write anthropological ethnographic studies. We've had groups in the field doing a range of different environmental or ecological studies. And over the course of these 5 years, we've embarked on a series of phases of work. So in phase 1, called Compound Vulnerabilities, we looked at the vulnerabilities to extreme weather events, particularly storm events, nor'easters, hurricanes. In phase 2, we looked at the kind of landscape of conservation and the way in which the kind of biology, the kind of biota, the landscape ecosystem might be available. And in phase 3, we looked at, well, what are the mechanisms of resilience? Like, how can we allow this place to continue to perceive its resilience going forward? And today, we're going to share with you the work of some academic advisors who have joined in this last tranche of work. Our steering committee have suggested they wanted to broaden the circle and think more about social science, politics, economy, because these topics are quite often imbricated. In phase 1, some of you will recall that we modeled a synthetic storm event for 2038, modeled on the Great Hurricane of 1938. And we used the best available hurricane modeling and the best available kind of geophysics to understand, well, where are the vulnerabilities? All of this material is published on our public-facing website, officeforurbanization.org. You can visit it, you can share it out, and of course, reach out to us if you have comments or questions. That work was identifying a lot of work that's already been done. And in that great storm of 2038, we identified a range of activities that people might choose to engage upon. What I want to reinforce here is that, again, this is not a plan. This has to do with the fact that individuals and institutions are already acting. We know that the reinsurance market for insuring your houses is changing. We know that mortgage prices are changing. We know that house values are changing based on a vulnerability to climate adaptation, in particular extreme weather events, increased storm events. And so in that context, over the coming decades, folks on Cape Ann have a vast menu of options to consider. And what I want to reinforce is, again, this is not a centralized activity. There's not going to be a central plan or one municipality leading this. All actors in civil society are already making decisions, already acting in the choices that they're making about the built environment. In this work and in phase 2, what you'll see is very, very deep research into understanding the literature that exists today, a range of best practices and precedents from around the world, and again, trying to inform and understand where are the places of vulnerability, where are the places of opportunity. Most recently, our work has suggested that if we look at the vulnerability to increased storm event, we look at the future of rising seas, we look at the future of increasing storm events, of course, the disaster preparedness and response is one important layer of this. Connected to that are questions of housing, ecosystems, and infrastructure. These things are all connected. And this most recent tranche of work focuses on these three areas. We understand that housing is particularly vulnerable here. The fact that it's very expensive already, it means that those that are the most vulnerable, especially financially, after a storm event would find it very difficult to rebuild here. They would very quickly be priced out of a market where adding additional housing stock is quite difficult. It's also true that there are right now 1,000 households that are in the FEMA floodplain already. And so among the recommendations that we've been making for the past several years are kind of intuitive things like, let's stop building in the floodplain. Maybe we should stop building in the marshes, right? So on the one hand, we think, secondary wastewater treatment for the town of Gloucester is probably a good idea. We don't require advanced degrees for that level of thinking, right? These are things that are quite self-evident. At the same time, if we look at the natural resources here on Cape Ann, you have the bounty of these extraordinary beaches and salt marshes, this extraordinary diversity of habitat and biodiversity. And of course, that's also changing. Many of your beaches will be allowed to migrate if the marshes can move. Other beaches will simply go away, subsumed by a rising tide, as they are no longer, because of the granite face or the infrastructure behind them, able to move. And so we've done quite a lot of work here, again, on our website that you can visit, looking at the relationship between those ecosystems and the infrastructures that underpin them. And of course, we are understanding the quite diverse municipal ranges, demographics, different populations. So setting the context of that, again, officeforurbanization.org, be happy to chat with you now and going forward about that work. It's important for us to publish this work, make it available internationally, in addition to helping think with folks in communities about future of the built environment. We also, of course, publish in our fields so as to help advise other institutions, other research universities like ours. And so today, you'll be hearing from our colleagues in three areas. In finance and risk, Jesse Keenan of Tulane University, Rachel Meltzer from the Harvard GSD. In engagement and communication, Jason Beckfield from sociology at Harvard, and Dan Dioka from the Harvard GSD. And in governance and policy, Arkan Fung and Diane Deva. So you'll be hearing from them over the course of a series of sessions in each of those areas. And let me pause there, and we're going to now hear from a video. See a video, hear from a video.
Thank you very much, Charles. So I'd like to introduce our next artist, Les Bartlett, Cape Ann historian, many of you know, international fine art photographer and lecturer. His quarry wall is across the street at the library, if you have a chance to go over there. So the second artist and the others presenting today were all part of an Imagining the Future of Gloucester event that the Gloucester Cultural Initiative convened, and you can find out more about that. But that was one more central lesson that I could have added at the beginning, that it's now understood that the best imaginaries are artists. As much as I mentioned how hard it is in our analytic minds, stuck in the present, leaders over and over are artists who are able to strike at the core of lessons and insights and realities of the life we're living in. So this second one from Les Bartlett, historian and photographer, is also about looking back to the past of this place we live in, as well as setting the stage for the financial challenges and housing issues that we'll hear about next. So, Les.
It's taken me probably 35 years to get here, to this room, and to be with all of you. When I first came to Cape Ann, I lived in Rockport. I never knew about Gloucester, and I worked my way around. So In preparation for this, a lot of talk with Valerie. We were co-presenters at a presentation she put together from the GCI at the LCC this summer called Rough Seas Ahead. And I think at the core is what you see in this slide in front of you, which is a photograph, local photograph from Cape Ann, Goose Cove. And we know the Goose Cove Causeway has flooded and is in fairly imminent danger of flooding again. And a cartoon from a national internet-based program. And they kind of mesh, but it's the work to be done. Just as there's work to be done by all of us today going forward. We've heard said there's no clear plan. There is no one single graphic, no one single artist. It's all of us working together to produce. How do I go forward with this? Right there. Uh-huh. What we produce is sand. It's true that Cape Ann is built on granite. I thought about bringing a shovel in here today and saying, go down, and those of you who are home landowners know the problem of digging down. You go to about 2 inches of topsoil and you hit sand. This is a map from 1831 by John Mason. It's entirely of Cape Ann, and all around it, the dark edge, are marshes and sand. So not only is this an island, it is an island where there were long expanses of open farmland, of open grasses going down to the ocean. And so the question of how we have followed a certain path blindly, now we have the opportunity to proceed with our eyes open. Because we can look at all the different areas where we've been in, and housing is a very important one. Got it. Okay, I got it. Okay. I'm focused in these very brief time upon the backshore of Cape Ann. I'm using Lanesville as an example. This is Lanesville through the 1940s, where it was sand. It was farms. You know, when I put this picture online, someone said, well, you know, we went out with sand and we put it in the gas tank of the bulldozer that was bulldozing the last barn. Now, what took the place of the sand was topsoil was brought in, a developer came in, and tiny little houses were built, summer cottages. There are practically none of those summer cottages left. Okay? As part of the problem, it became automatic. The land became valuable. Valuable also to the artist. This is a painting very similar to this by Stanley Woodward in the 50s. When artists felt that there was a nor'easter coming down the coast, from Maine, from Nova Scotia through Maine, through Newburyport, they went to Lanesville to paint, because they could see it, they could see across. And that's what we need to return to ourselves, is seeing a bit more of what the possibilities are. That's the exciting thing of so many artistic directions and venues. But look, I have to stand away from the microphone. Everyone here is an artist. Let's just make that clear. Everyone is concerned. Everyone in their own way is looking to build a future for their children and grandchildren. So I want to show you 3 maps, if I remember correctly. Great. This is Lanesville in the 1858 era. It shows Lanes Cove, and it shows houses along the main road. Nothing to the ocean, nothing to the sea. This is Lanesville, the same area, tried to focus in on, in the 1880s, where now there are land lots that extend down. I own from here right down to the water line, this much. This is me, okay? No roads, no houses, this is me. This is what I've got. Again, we follow, this has become automatically following the importance of land as a financial development. Okay? This is Lanesville, 10 years, 1890, around 1900. And now, what I own, I've subdivided. I've got my farm, I've got ways of building. And it's no longer addressing the question of, what does it mean, after all, to be looking at the ocean? The first people that came to Cape Ann, that came to be at the ocean, were Unitarian ministers. And they came to be renewed so they could go back to the city and take care of people in the city, because the city was the city. This is a Google map from 2 days ago of the same area. And I think you can see the difference. Yeah, I know it's kind of hard. You can see. Everybody can see? Yeah. And you know, I was involved this summer. So it's this, for me, it's a basic question. How do we look at the shoreline? And it's a fact. What I've learned from Valerie is so amazing is that, and learned in general, is that if these houses are hit, when these houses are hit by storm surge, and the question of rebuilding comes to the foreground, there's sticker shock across the board. So the sticker shock has to be, we need to find simple ways to relate to the thinking and the words to what we have available to us, which is an extraordinary resource. And we can do it, even if we have to cross the bridge. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you for that amazing story into our past and how we are at some of the vulnerabilities that we're in now. And by the way, I don't know if I properly thanked all the faculty members in the room who've come. I wanted to acknowledge all of you in the audience, but heartfelt thanks to the multiple faculty you hear from, and some earlier from UMass Boston. And I think they've come to care about us some, but and they're giving us the best of themselves to help us on our journey forward. So thank you for coming. Could we just applaud for them to be here? So now looking forward into the future of where we are, well, present, and also some possible visions for doing things differently in very powerful ways that are there for us to consider changing our practices, is a remarkable video by Lisa Smith of the Wingershik Marsh ecosystem, and that was in coordination with Eric Hutchins, who many of you know from his decades of incredible work here on saving our marshes and woodlands across the Cape. So, Lisa, I don't know where you are, if you could just raise your hand. And here's Lisa's remarkable video on the present and the future. So thank you.
Cape Ann has a beautiful coastline that supports tourism, fishing, and recreational activities. These areas are also ecosystems that are vital to support wildlife and humans. All living things need a healthy habitat to survive on this planet. Visiting Wingershik Beach, we marvel at the soft white sand underfoot, the granite rocks on the shoreline with their tide pools, and the towering sand dunes. But these dunes have a hidden story of destruction. In 1965, the Army Corps of Engineers completed the dredging of the Annisquam River. The sediment dredged from the river was deposited on the salt marsh at Wingershik Beach. At that time, it was legal to do this. Eric Hutchins, a marine biologist and habitat restoration specialist, delves into the consequences the Annisquam River dredging project has had on the Wingershik Beach ecosystem.
We are actually located at the eastern anchor of the Great Marsh system. And this is one of the largest contiguous salt marsh areas north of, I believe, down in Connecticut. Runs all the way from almost literally where we're standing here in Gloucester on the Annisquam River at Wingershik Beach, all the way up into the Hampton area just about of southern New Hampshire. It's a broad area of salt marsh. And because we have the Annisquam River here, it's a nice anchor. We've got a lot of species that actually migrate into the Annisquam River and actually go up the Little River, such as river herring. We've got rainbow smelt, American eel habitat. There's a lot of species that come in here that support this larger system. This area behind me, off to my left, where all that Phragmites is growing, about 12 to 14 acres, what originally was salt marsh. Most every day, the high tides would cover the surface of the marsh and support many species of marine animals, plants, crabs, larval lobsters, all up in this area. This was all marine habitat until they dredged the Annisquam River so that vessels could make it through the Annisquam River. What they first did was built a berm, which we're standing on. It's about 6 feet high, and it's maybe a half mile long. They circled the marsh. And the berm is basically constructed of a wall of dirt 6 to 8 feet high. They just brought dump load after dump truck load of dirt in here and built a pile of dirt in a straight line. And it goes for about a half a mile. And they made a polygon, an area inside the salt marsh, and cut off the salt water. They raised it high enough so salt water could no longer get in here. They made a big bowl inside this area of what was intertidal salt marsh. And then they did what's called suction dredging. They had huge pumps in the Annisquam River to dredge out the channel in a pipe probably 18 to 24 inches wide, and they pumped it as a slurry, so a mixture of sand and gravel and pebbles from the bottom of the Annisquam River, pumped it over the dune grass behind the dune and dumped it all in here. So the water would run out and the sediment would stay. So when it was all done, they raised the level of the salt marsh, which no longer got salt water, by anywhere from 3 to 5 feet. So they basically turned 12 to 14 acres of intertidal, meaning the tide went in there every day, to a dirt dump. And the salt water doesn't reach here anymore other than through large storm events. What I like to tell people is, from a marine habitat perspective, if the salt water can't reach the habitat anymore, if you have no water, you simply don't have fish. It's as simple as that. You've cut the water out. 12 to 14 acres of habitat no longer supports juvenile fish. Many of the species that we like to catch and eat would have actually grown in this area, mostly as juveniles. So this is a wonderful location right here at the high tide line. I'm standing where last night's high tide reached up to here. Last night this would have been underwater. We've got all the variety of habitats here. We have intertidal habitat for salt marsh down here, the beach habitat, dune habitat. And then if you look off to my right, you can see the invasive Phragmites starting to take over this dune, coming right down to the beach over here. And they're slowly taking over even the upland here, where we have cedar trees and poplars and others. Almost all of our species, whether it's insects, birds, and otherwise, they haven't adapted to it. So it's not forage food for a lot of our native species. It doesn't provide nesting habitat for a lot of birds and other wildlife. The vision that I and many others have had at this site, going back about 15 years now, it's relatively simple. It's to remove the dredge disposal material, regrade it down. So you'd bring machinery into this marsh, remove the berm, regrade the salt marsh, bring it back, take the dredge disposal material out of here, which would be anywhere from 2 to maybe 5 feet in some locations, and bring it back down. The original peat, the original salt marsh is still down there, the material that it would like to grow in, and create a new, what's called a dendritic system. It's kind of like the veins in your arms, but basically new creeks and channels throughout the 12 to 14 acres, maybe upwards of that amount, and restore pools for fish, creeks, mudflat for soft-shell clams, as well as American eel habitat, which young American eels and juveniles love this type of habitat. From a climate resilience perspective, one of the benefits of undertaking salt marsh restoration at this location is it helps put this dune system back in equilibrium with nature. With future storms, even just sea level rise, storm surges, even just natural tides, it allows this dune system to migrate inland like it normally and naturally would have, where you would have salt marsh on this side, beach, dunes in the middle. Salt marshes, when given the right opportunity, can actually keep up with a certain level of sea level rise. They can capture sediment, and actually they can rise with increasing sea levels over years to come. If it can keep up with sea level rise, can and will provide some level of storm surge and sea level rise protection to the surrounding human infrastructure in this area. Ecological benefits creates ecological resilience for the future of the habitat and the marine and avian species that are located here at Winged Sheep Beach.
Lisa, Eric, thank you so much for that wonderful video. I think it's an excellent introduction to the ways in which the natural ecosystems that are so much a part of the beauty and the life of this place, the beach ecosystems, the salt marsh, the upland forests, you know, the granite underpinnings, that these things are all connected to the infrastructural choices that we make and will make in the future, right? These things are all connected in a way. So thank you for that. It's a wonderful introduction. Of course, our research corroborates precisely this proposal to restore 12 to 14 acres of salt marsh. We're big advocates of nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions will not solve all of your problems. Most people in this space, as we will advocate for a combination of green and gray infrastructural responses. In this case, not all of your beaches will be able to migrate, but many can. Not all of your marshes will be able to retreat, but many will be able to. We're also big advocates of the removal of the WPA era marsh drainage ditches and a number of other incremental infrastructural choices that were made over the course of the 20th century. Again, you can find more about that in our recommendations at officeforurbanization.org. I'd also like to mention that we are just right on time. Thank you all for being here. I believe we're also on budget, thanks to all of our supporting partners. So we're now going to pivot to the first panel. We know that adaptation to climate change, we know that increasing the resilience of places like Cape Ann will put enormous pressure or challenge on the existing fiscal and financial frameworks. We know that our governmental structures are robust and long-serving, but it's not clear that they are presently aligned for the scale and character of the challenges that we'll face. And similarly, it's not always clear that the forms of communication that we've developed, the forms of engagement with broad publics, are adequate to the new challenges that we'll face. So in this next session, we're going to talk about finance and risk, and we're very pleased to be joined by two extraordinary academics, the first of which is Dr. Jesse Keenan from Tulane University, who will help us understand how we can avoid a climate doom loop that does not sound good.
Thank you very much for having me. Talking about avoiding the climate doom loop, lessons from Cape Ann, but also lessons from America. It's memorialized in a new book that I have, North, The Future of Post-Climate America, available on Oxford University Press. And that book is about how climate change can alter how and where Americans live. But today's thesis is that municipal fiscal stress is going to throw the climate policies that many have in this region out the window, and it's really actually going to only make the problem worse. So let's talk about the non-climate problem. Local budgets are sensitive to the withdrawal of state and federal transfers. State aid has been declining at a good clip over the years. You gave up a property tax cap in exchange for state transfers. In fact, over this century, we've seen a 25% reduction in state aid when adjusting for inflation. Prop 2.5, which limits your capacity to tax yourselves, has very limited capacity for overriding politically. And the total levy, which you're capped at, is unlikely to be adjusted by the legislature. In fact, the levy for taxing yourself all across the region is already reaching a critical threshold. Under Massachusetts law, you cannot raid your capital funds for operating. And at the end of the day, what we see is the capacity for capital projects diminish and flounder, in part because of the increased operating expenses. Massachusetts has actually spent below the national average in terms of state transfers to support local operating budgets. There's good and bad things about this. The bad thing is that you've basically been underinvesting. And at the end of the day in Massachusetts, the tax cap can't keep up with inflation, and it can't keep up with aging infrastructure. In fact, in the last 20 years, you've been increasing that rate of municipal expense by about 0.6% per year. It's far slower than the US national average. You're not keeping up with inflation, your capacity to tax and spend. Climate is just another measure of inflation. So what's the likely outcome? CapEx goes down, fewer capital projects, deferred maintenance goes up, OpEx, fees, charges go up, services go down, fewer teachers in particular, education is particularly hit in this context. And this is quite important. There's conflicting pressure to drive development growth, which, by the way, is one of the ways that one increases the levy cap is to grow. The question is, what kind of growth? And that's a central question that we face today. So the question is, well, how does climate change make this fiscal problem worse? Well, there's increased operating costs for an aging infrastructure. You also have increased borrowing costs in the bond market. This is also a non-climate problem under conditions of fiscal stress that you currently face. And by the way, rough seas ahead, independent of climate change when it comes to municipal finance, and you're going to find that out this year and next year. The property tax base is exposed, and you're going to find out more about that. It's marginal, but it's exposed, and every dollar counts. At the same time, insurance, mortgage, property face risk-free pricing and revaluation. This drives stress. By the way, increased OpEx costs for infrastructure also increase OpEx costs for an aging population. That's a joke, by the way. Observe climate risks in markets that bear and define the affordability and accessibility to be able to live in this region are widespread, and they vary in their degree of robustness empirically, as well as the distributional implications. But the bottom line, nothing's getting cheaper in the context of climate change, and in a high exposed areas we face here, it's becoming more expensive. And this is, again, an additional measure of inflation or stress in the broader challenges of affordability. So what happens if a storm hits? What happens if the big hurricane hits? And we're in the context of a post-FEMA landscape where we can't rely on federal aid. We know in the empirical literature that federal aid stabilizes a tax base, sales tax, housing. There's so many different dimensions to that. But it does serve as a very important fiscal stability mechanism. And research has shown that when you remove fiscal aid and support, we face the prospects of significant bond default. And in fact, all across this country, as we enter into a period of local and state austerity, including here in the state of Massachusetts, we can expect emerging defaults and even municipal bankruptcies on the horizon. Clyde, Texas last year, one of 12 municipal bankruptcies, or defaults rather, I should say, attributable in part to climate change. So there's a lot of strong, let's say, disincentives not to do anything about climate in a local government. There's contingent political and economic benefits. Who knows when one would benefit from the investments that we're making today? You're better off really not knowing the risk, because once you know the risk, you have an obligation to disclose, then you have a duty to act, and there's often a perceived disclosure penalty. But here's the bottom line. Across this country, increasingly in the municipal bond market, disclosures are required. Credit rating agencies want to see that you're doing something about your underlying exposure risk. And the municipal bond market is pricing exposure. The credit rating agencies are driving this for both physical and transition risk, because the implications for a local property tax base, sales tax, and the like are significant. Interestingly enough, the risk premium, that is the additional borrowing cost, is greater for the longer term bonds. So the longer you issue the debt, if you try to amortize over a longer period of time, the greater the risk premium. But the good news is, if you do something about it and you can convince the credit rating agency you are, and by the way, they're asking, and there's a dialogue always ongoing in this regard, you're going to get a benefit. They will look at this, that is, your capacity to plan and engage in risk mitigation and climate adaptation, as a benefit. So there is a clear benefit in the market at this point. But there's also an unresolved tension. And the unresolved tension, driven by the credit rating agencies, is whether you should save up a bunch of cash for when the big disaster hits, particularly in a post-FEMA context, or whether you should be making long-term capital investments. Guess what? In the context of the emerging fiscal crisis that you face here, neither option is a strong option, either politically or economically. So municipal bonds today across the board are increasingly understood to be exposed. About 10% of the municipal bond market is understood to have a material fiscal risk, $420 billion, and the evidence across various, let's say, classes of impact, floods, coastal wildfires, and the like. By the way, wildfires is a very interesting dimension in the region that we never really talk about. It's fairly robust and well understood in the marketplace. So why are local governments incentivized? We know they are disincentivized politically and economically, but why are they incentivized to plan for climate adaptation? It's because you want to avoid the climate and non-climate doom loop. Here's the climate doom loop, and this is a riff off of Steen von Neuberg's urban doom loop, which we saw during COVID when people hollowed out downtowns in the tax base from just consumption in an urban context. Taxes and the cost of living go up, services go down, cost burdens go up, asset values go down, spending goes down, and public revenue goes down. It's a reinforcing cycle that you really want to avoid. And this seems like a distant problem, but the emerging fiscal shock that you face, and climate stress, because it's a stress, it's both a shock and a stress, but let's call it a stress for now, are deeply connected and interrelated, both as a problem set, but also as a set of solutions. So here's your options, at least from my point of view. You have to think about regional contracting and public services cooperation. This is a problem all across New England. You have tiny little towns who are too small to economically work and cooperate together. It's a political artifice. 1873, I believe, split off from Essex. You have to mainstream adaptation planning and think about every single investment that you make. Every single investment in infrastructure, in land use, and zoning, stop building in the flood zone, has to consider climate and the long-term consequences of the capital investments, of the decisions that you're making today. You have to incorporate life cycle analysis and asset management to begin to account for the impairment. The way it's currently done is $15,000 here, $50,000 here out of operating. And you have to get accustomed to the idea that you need to strategically decommission assets. You're going to have to think about not necessarily where you grow, but where you remove and decommission your investments. It's not necessarily where you grow. It's also how you manage your relocation. At the end of the day, the big challenge through land use, capital planning, infrastructure, politically, is to diversify and shift your tax base. People have been talking about diversification of the tax base here for an awfully long time in terms of maritime industries and the like. But at the end of the day, in terms of the built environment, in terms of land use, tax, sales, etc., this is your underlying challenge. So in this context, the model that you have before you is to plan for the future. for sustainable urban growth. It increases your tax levy capacity in the current fiscal challenge, it shifts your tax base, and it gives you a capacity to manage for the future. Because just like it says right there, build not for today, but for tomorrow as well. So you either grow your way out of this problem or you risk entering the doom loop. So go ahead, create a escape plan today before it's too late. Buy my book on Oxford University Press, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Jesse. We are going to have ample time for comments, questions, discussion in this session after the remarks by our second academic advisor, our colleague at the Harvard GSD, Dr. Rachel Meltzer, who will help us think about how we might plan for fiscal resilience here in Cape Ann. Rachel.
Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. Thank you, Jesse, for teeing me up really nicely. I'm going to zoom in. So I'm going to show you some analyses we did, and I will mention two students, Avni Lavasa and Yihao Wu, who are not here, but were critical in making this work happen. And I just really want to put out the disclaimer. You'll see we did kind of a case study analysis of Manchester by the Sea. It is intended to be very stylized. I don't want you to walk away thinking that we got the numbers exactly right. I think, I don't know if that might make you feel better when you see some of the numbers, but I think we wanted to give you a sense, certainly, of like order of magnitude, and offer up a strategy for analysis here. Give you some kind of framework for thinking about how you can put some numbers to the problem you have and to the problem that Jesse just set up. So I'm gonna drill down a little. And I'm gonna start here with this article. It's not about Cape Ann. This was out in Nantucket, but this popped up while we were working on this project and seemed very timely and relevant. And I think there's 2 points from this article. You can look it up and read the full article, but I think it's a story that you're probably familiar with, right? A $2 million home that ends up being sold for $200,000 because the coast is eroding. So it was concluded that that home probably might not be around in 6 months. So 2 points here. As you can see, the value of that asset went down multifold, and it is entirely due to where it's located and the threat of the incoming water there, right? The second point is someone is still buying that home, right? Which kind of, Jesse alluded to. So it raises, this idea of the value of this asset, right, and how it is dramatically affected by these events. But that value, is still there, right? There's still an asset there. There can still maybe be something recouped from the value of the location and what you have in place, which was so nicely set up at the beginning of this gathering. So I'm going to set up a way of thinking about what I call fiscal resilience. So we talk about this term resilience, and you can apply it in the context of public finance, that these extreme weather events are inevitably going to cause physical damage and destruction, possibly, and to understand that those physical assets hold great financial value. And that financial value is important because it spins off, right, the revenue you need to provide the services and to provide a quality of life here. And so we really need to be thinking about these physical assets, how they are valued, and how we can maintain or, right, kind of relocate that value, which is something that, right, Jesse alluded to. So I just want to set up a framework here. This is something that's called a resiliency function that looks a lot more maybe complicated than it actually is. There's a lot of versions of these. I like this one because on the vertical, you can see it talks about this idea of system performance. And you could put a lot of things there, right? You could put something more, less quantitative, like, cultural cohesion, or you could talk about something very concrete, like tax revenues, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. And on the x-axis, there's this time component, right? This temporality, to understand that these things aren't constant, they change over time, and they change in response to these events. And this models a shock, a discrete event. I know you all come up against kind of more chronic water events too, and we can apply that there, but I'm setting this up more as like a discrete, there's like a before and after these events, right? So you can see before the curve, there are conditions here. There are kind of baseline circumstances. I'm gonna set that up fiscally, right, to understand like what's the fiscal base you have, what's the value of the assets you have right now to work with. A shock comes down, right? A hurricane event, an extreme flooding event, and the value of those assets is gonna drop, right? We see that immediately. It might be because they get physical destruction that immediately reduces some value. And the real question here, and for you all, is, how far is that drop, right? Can you do anything to kind of mediate the depth of that drop? When you drop, how long do you stay in that trough, right? How wide and how deep and wide is that trough? And then what does that rebound look like, right? How steep is that curve? And do you get to a place better than you were before? Do you get where you were before, or that bottom line, which is not the line you want to be on, right? Do you kind of continue this decline? So I like this because I think it's a useful way to understand, in a dynamic way, what resilience might look like. Okay, so how we did this, how we're going to take the data to try to understand. Model, again, in a very kind of stylized way, this idea of fiscal resilience is we first had to understand, how do we model or put out there this idea of risk, right? How do we say one place is more risky than another? And it turns out there actually is not one single agreed upon model or strategy to do that. These are the three most commonly used models out there. One that comes from NOAA that projects out the sea level rise. We're using the models that project out to 2045 just because we wanted it to coincide with the Massachusetts coastal risk model, which is projecting out to about 2050. And then there's the FEMA 100-year flood maps, which is the 1%, right, annual risk of flooding. I'm going to defer all questions about these models to Jesse over there, because I'm sure he knows a lot more about what's happening in the background than I do. But you'll see in a second that they predict very different degrees of risk and possibilities for flooding, depending on which one you use. So we started here, and again, as I said, we did our kind of casework here in Manchester. But I'll, in the end, explain how this could make sense, obviously, as a framework and approach in other locations. So we started with a parcel map of Manchester by the Sea, right? This is just how the city, the lots and blocks are mapped right now. And the first thing we wanted to understand, knowing that, right, as Jesse alluded to, that over 95% of your revenue base comes from property taxes, right, from the value of these physical assets that are there. So we wanted to map that out and see what that looks like relative to, the exposure locations. And you can all guess, and I'll show you in a minute, that closer to the water, you're more at risk, right, of being exposed to these water events. So the darker red areas are higher valued properties. So you can see a clear pattern here, with the exception of, what is that? The club in the middle, that big red lot in the middle, right, is the golf course, right? The golf course or country club. So very highly valued, right, piece of land there. So that's the one, right, red area that's farther from the coast, but it gets redder as you get closer to the water, right? So value here, which makes sense, right? Being close to the water is an amenity. That's going to drive the value up. But it turns out, right, those are the areas that are going to be most exposed. So we can see then, what I'm going to show you here is the same map, showing you the different models of risk, right? The three that I laid out, and how they tell us different stories of what that exposure might look like. This is the NOAA map, and you can see again, darker indicates just more of that parcel or lot is at risk of 4 feet of flooding by 2045, the model setting that we chose. So, it's a little spotty there, right? But again, concentrated around the coast there. Gets a little darker, right, as we use the Massachusetts, the coastal flooding risk model there. But you can already see these are different, right? So if you went on this, you're missing a layer of projected risk that wasn't understood in that or other model. And these are the FEMA flood maps, which tell us a whole different story. And I see Jesse laughing. This is, now they're intended to pick up something, right? These all, underneath are trying to do slightly different things. But this is what, for example, lenders, right? When they say you need to get insurance with your mortgage, they're using these maps to project, right, who's in the flood map, who's at risk of flooding or not. And it designates a whole different part of Manchester in terms of what's at risk. So the first point here is like know how you're understanding risk, and not to rely on one, but to understand that these tell us different stories, and we have to look across them to understand the range of potential futures. Okay, so now what we do is we pull this information together. We now know spatially what parcels are at relative risk. We know the value of those assets, and I try to now understand in aggregate, right, what that looks like across space for these different models. So the blue bars are the NOAA models, the green bars are the Massachusetts coast flooding models, and the orange red are the FEMA map projections, right? And the y-axis here is just aggregate dollars of assessed value. Again, this is the foundation. Not all of that, right, gets spun off into revenue, but that's the foundation of the revenue generation, and we just split up total land and building just to break it down. But you can see, not surprising, right, the projected kind of exposure to risk based on the value of the assets goes up, right, as we move along, right? It's highest in that FEMA framework. And just to give you a sense here, the assessed value, right, that's captured here in the NOAA areas, for example, is nearly, a quarter of the total residential assessed value in, Manchester. So these are not small amounts, right? This is a substantial share of the overall tax base there. What we did here is now we wanted to understand, and the other, that little red sliver on the top are commercial. There's a very small subset of parcels that are designated commercial. This is mostly about residential use. What we did next was to understand if there was a difference in exposure depending on the age of the property. This was a proxy for, kind of the resiliency of the structure, the expectation that older properties might be less resilient in the face of some kind of flooding event. We used 2012 as a cutoff because there was some sense that the state put down general laws around structural resiliency requirements. I'm not saying this is the right cutoff, but we were trying to understand a reasonable way to cut it off. And you can see, so the darker lines are the old structures, and the dotted areas are the new. So the story here is that most of the exposed assets are older structures. So exposure, and the ones that are less likely, again, this is crude, but less likely to maybe be resilient in the face of these events are the ones that are most exposed here. And here we just break it down, that was in terms of value, right? And this is in terms of just size, like building area, the amount of square footage. They follow a similar story. So this is not about, some distortion of it being driven by smaller properties, high value. There's also just an amount of space and land that is being exposed here. So what does this mean in terms of what it translates into dollars? And I don't want you to go home saying that, thinking that these numbers are right, but I just want to show you the progression, right, as it changes depending on the models we use, and the order of magnitude here, right? So, back of the envelope, as a share, right, of all tax revenue that's getting, spun off these assets, and we're making an assumption, we use the current tax levy per thousand, we're using the current rates. The NOAA model projects, again, this is maybe a quarter of tax revenues, right, that is going to be underwater in a sense, and it goes up depending on the models that you use. Okay, so the last exercise we did, and again, Jesse alluded to this, is, so what do you do, right? This is a quarter of your tax base that could be inoperable at worst, maybe reduced in value at best. That's going to be felt in the revenues that get spun off of that. So what one exercise is to think about, well, could we take those assets and kind of move them someplace else, right? If they really lose their value or lose, right, become obsolete physically, is there any other place that we could regain that tax base? So we took, the current zoning map there, and we did an analysis to understand, so we know the current size of the structures, we know the zoning, designation of the parcels, we know the current size of the structures, we know the maximum FAR, or what is allowed to be built, and we kind of found the gap, right? So this is, yes, in some ways, many ways, a thought exercise, because there are existing structures there, and we're assuming you can kind of build on top or take that down and build bigger, but it's just to give you a sense of there is room to grow, right, in terms of the regulatory framework you're working in. Obviously, the questions about how to do this and, the will to do it is a different story. So you see kind of the flip here. Remember the first map I showed you was red by the coast? The red here are areas to build. Now, I think that's a lot of commercial uses back there, right, like where it's red. So yes, there's something about the designation of use here that has to be considered, but this is where you could kind of regain some of the square footage or assets that might be lost due to rising waters. Okay, so just in summary, just to bring it together, first point is it depends what risk model you use. It tells you a different story, and the point is not that one is universally right, but you need to understand what's going into those models, but also the range of outcomes that they might project. There's a range of the fiscal implications that they project, right, depending on the models, and these are very crude, again, back of the envelope estimates, but the idea is that you could end up with between 20% impact up to 40%. These are millions of dollars that are at risk because of the rising waters, and that's a meaningful hit in a town of this size. So I'll end on two things, right? So what do how to think about this challenge? Yes, where can you regain, rethink, repurpose physical space and assets that will not be at risk based on these models? But you also want to think, which I didn't really get into, but each of these buildings and assets, right, serves a different economic purpose, right? And the economic activity in those buildings determines the value of those buildings too. So it's not just a kind of exercise of finding the space and how high you can build, but thinking about what activity is actually going to go in those spaces, right? And how can that feed into the revenue that you generate to sustain, the town moving forward. I will stop there, but happy to talk about and think about how this approach can be applied in other settings. This, again, was just a way to test it out.
So thank you, Jesse and Rachel. And now we enter the first of our numerous engagement with each other and with the faculty. You'll see that they're sitting here, and Greg, if you want to come up together, you and I can field. There'll be a microphone that, if you're called on, the microphone will come, so we have a recording of this. And our thought was that you probably have some questions of the lecturers. We'll maybe 10 minutes on that, and then we'd like to have you even talk to each other about and spin off of what you're all making of it. And geez, it's a huge shock. But in terms of questions, just privilege here, Jesse, I'd like to ask the first one. I'd like to highlight again the upcoming book you have on December 19th called North, and refer again to your doom loop. And could you just talk a little bit more about, in the end, it sounds like we'll survive it with growth. Can you talk about, because ultimately it is a massive, severe storm that does the most damage to infrastructure, housing, power grids, water, sewer rates, roads, everything. In your book, are you finding that as much as they try to grow, that sometimes doom loops are inevitable with the extent of crises coming? And then what do communities look like? They don't they're not erased, but Doom Loop Down, inability to grow and respond to this, what happens over time that some kind of community is left? What are you finding it looks like?
So I don't, the question is, what's the terminal threshold from which the doom loop results in a kind of forfeiture of one's governance or a receivership or conservatorship of your municipality and the like? I don't think we're reaching that level here in Cape Ann across the board. There are places in the United States, in Florida, in North Carolina, in Louisiana, where we do face essentially liquidation of assets and the conservatorship of smaller jurisdictions and public utilities that are already deeply underwater, debt to income, revenue, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think we're in that position here. What I worry about in the context of the doom loop is a declining quality of life and declining services and a contraction of the amenitization, of the value, of the cohesiveness economically of a community, and that may lead to a long decline. That may not necessarily be a bad thing in some places, but it's going to be painful, and that is those are the mechanisms from which we have to keep an eye out to avoid the worst of that pain.
And I think what you've all alluded to is let me just finish and then Rachel, is that what is at stake is the character and identity and culture and history and legacy of this community being able to continue as these threats grow. And also that I think it's fair to say, Jesse, that in many places, Asheville, North Carolina, those who are left are the most affluent and not necessarily our children and grandchildren. So it's a highlight of the severe, is that not true? Yes.
That's exactly right.
That's exactly right. So Rachel, you wanted to add in.
Yeah, I would add the doom loop, right, which actually was coined based on the fear after COVID that no one would return to the offices and these office buildings would lay, empty, and a lot of cities rely similarly on the revenues that are thrown off of those buildings to support services. Again, the story that Jesse told. But I will say that the doom loop that Stein predicted actually hasn't happened in that context. So and the reason why, I think, is because a lot of places did respond and adjust, right? So that might mean converting, commercial to residential, thinking about, again, the economic activity that occupied those spaces. How can we use it in a way that makes them productive again? The places that have kind of had a longer tail of this are the ones that haven't been able to pivot for different reasons. So I think it speaks to, it's a good example of how this can be kind of nipped in the bud if there is a response, not just in the physical infrastructure, but thinking also about, right, the structure of the kind of fiscal landscape, right? Are we relying too much, for example, on office, based revenues? Do we need to rethink the structure of our local economy? So this could be an opportunity to do that and avoid the doom loop scenario.
So maybe I've been exposed as to why I might have retired. But anyway, tongue in cheek. Part of your presentations certainly suggests a bit of a taboo topic, which is managed retreat. Are there areas where you're seeing that being done effectively? And are there other alternatives to retreat? Obviously, people try to harden and have more resistance to rising waters. Yeah, stilts, exactly.
Yeah, so managed relocation is driven in part by, at this point in time, the experience has been quite ad hoc. There has been some public policies that support relocations, buyout programs, for instance, of housing in high-risk areas. It's mostly been the market, or I would say disproportionately the market,
that has been trying to bring some order in a kind of what we call price signal theory, the idea that you're starting to send signals to people and that they begin to sort out or find ways to move out of these areas for a variety of different reasons. So as a managed process, as a managed public process, there's not a lot of experience. It tends to target very, very high-risk areas with uniquely in the context of flood and increasingly in California with fire. But when you're talking about managed relocation, you're not just moving a tax base or transferring a tax base. You're moving people, you're moving medical records, there's a lot of institutions across time and space that have to transform and move with those people. And it is something that takes some time to do and requires a large cooperative effort. The federal government had a lot of money from the IRA to do a pilot program for tribal relocation. And you had to think about, the White House, I document this in the book, I was in these meetings at the White House. You had to have people working with Social Security Administration to move addresses. You had to move professional licenses from one place to another. You had to move business loans. I mean, the totality of what grounds us to place is enormous. And it's not as simple as just rezoning, although this is where we begin, and programmatically, this is the argument that I think we both make. But it has to be a coordinated process in theory, in the best sort of outcome, among public, private, and civic participants in that regard.
I'll just add I do think it's useful to think about the channels that have been proven to work. So as Jesse alluded to, this market channel, which is really about information, right? Making the risks really clear and salient to people so that when they consider staying in that home or selling it or buying it, that risk is part of the calculation, right? The price should reflect that, right? The fact that that home went down from 2 million to 200,000 is actually probably right? In the sense that it is internalizing the risk of being there, right? That home is not going to be there in 6 months. So there's things in place that make it harder to make that risk clear, things that the government does, things that institutions do. So like locally, what's really useful is to make those things more clear to people, right? And it starts to be internalized in those decisions, which is hard because there's a lot loaded into that, right? The connection to place and the connection to those homes. But there's a lot to be said about the importance of information channels. The only other example I'll give is I've done research on the pricing of risk and flooding risk. And what we find is that for homes that are in the flood zone already, after a flooding event or a hurricane, prices actually don't change much. They go down for maybe 6 months and then they pop back up because the risk was already incorporated into that price in a sense, right? Because in the flood zones, again, when you get a mortgage, those are the places that are mandated to get insured. So you already have this channel telling you about the risk. And so the prices already reflect that. Outside the flood zone is where we see significant drops in prices after these events, like 10% plus. Why? And they stay, right? These are persistent declines in prices because that risk wasn't salient before. No one knew systematically that risk was there because they weren't in the flood zones. And that's been a major channel of conveying this risk to people in this country. And so that's where we see, but that's a shock, right? All of a sudden your home is worth 10% less. So there's value also to being able to internalize these risks, gradually instead of having it being done for you by some extreme event.
So questions from the audience, please. Yeah, Peter, go ahead. And we'd love to get you a microphone.
Yeah, where's Mike? Here's Keith.
There should be another one.
I have more of a comment than a question. I noticed, Rachel, in your managed retreat, managed relocation, you showed an area in Manchester where it's undeveloped. That's why you chose it, I'm sure, but it's being protected for the purpose of trying to offset some of the impacts of climate change, which is causing the problem in the first place. Made me think that most of the managed relocation locations would be of that nature along the coastline. And so you're solving one problem, but you're creating or exacerbating the problem that you're actually solving. So I'm wondering what the direction might be to go if you think about that, that all the places that you want to relocate to are places where you're protecting the natural environment.
And great point, and I accept and know that this was like a bird's eye view, and I don't know the landscape on the ground in the same way, so I appreciate that. I don't know. I don't know if I have the answer. I think I don't know if that's really like all the excess space that you have is area that's being protected for other reasons. And I'd want to understand those details more. I don't know if there's any give there. Is there a way to achieve both? I don't, the only thing I can say is I think a lot of the solutions I feel like are technologically achievable, right? We've thought of and invented a lot of things technologically, right? Like we've solved a lot of hard problems with designing and engineering things. I wonder, I don't know, is there anything, sometimes the challenges tend to be, the messier ones tend to be, political, cultural, which are not easy things to solve. So without knowing the site better, my question would be, is there any way to achieve both? Like, are there parts of these sites that could be usable in other ways while still preserving the natural part? I don't know, right? It might require creativity.
Part of that
So the
might be density as well.
What?
Part of it might be re-examining density.
Yeah, going denser elsewhere, yes, or
So-
kind of building up and smaller. Yep.
The go-to experience is infill development as it relates to density and upzoning. I work for the governor of California. Arcata, California comes to mind. They had some portion of their tax base, industrial tax base, directly on Humboldt Bay. They knew that they needed to shift those uses, not just the base, but the uses themselves, and they essentially doubled down on their density, and that had collateral benefit in terms of for traffic, foot traffic downtown, population traffic downtown, sales, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, in this region, we had that opportunity with MBTA upzoning and TOD requirements, which pretty much got wasted as an opportunity in that regard. So you really have to think concretely about affordable housing, about the densification in these areas. Infill development is a function of housing renovation as well. It's not just new development, it's renovating the often aging housing stock that you have. All those things add up programmatically, square foot by square foot, as Rachel wonderfully outlined. But that's the go-to model all across this country. And you've got all the elevation and much of the benefits land use-wise here already.
Yes, well.
Sam.
Sam, I'm
Sam.
sorry, go ahead.
Sam, please. Keaton will bring it.
He's got one right behind you.
Thank you for great presentations. Just a couple of questions. Talked a little bit about the necessity of regional thinking around small towns. Can you give a couple of examples of either counties or areas of the country? Massachusetts, as you know, is currently looking into resilient coasts and developing groups around that. Is there any possibility of return to county government? Can you name a couple of successful areas, say in Virginia, like areas as per Cape Ann, that are moving forward in tandem with the state, thinking that, at least for the time being, federal aid may be very limited?
I want to defer to Professor Davis, who I think is going to tee up regionalism in a conversation around that. I am unaware of successful or politically accessible movements to return to county government. But what we do see is that those states with county governments, Florida being an example, I hate to cite Florida for anything in this regard, benefit greatly from the role of the counties in engaging and coordinating municipalities. And ultimately, I think across New England, counties are going to have to be empowered to take over much of their infrastructure and public service. This is my opinion. I know that's controversial.
There is just one example. I don't think it's in the context of climate, but around Minneapolis, there is something known as tax-based sharing, which has been there for a long time. So I don't know if it's a model for like retroactively implementing, but it's an interesting case to look at. It's a scenario where all the local, basically, there's some share of the local tax revenues that get pooled back into a regional pool, and then they get redistributed regionally. It's kind of a model for a regional tax sharing program. So interesting to look into, but I think it's a unique example.
So thank you, Jesse and Rachel. And now the second part of this open discussion is intended to shift from the lectures up front and really to hear from you. So I might phrase it, and then you all can hear from each other as well as residents and officials and nonprofit leaders. What do you make of this? What thoughts have come to your mind about the extent of the challenge, or just what do you make of what you heard that you'd like to offer to all of us as a reaction about what our challenges are going forward? Does anyone want to take the lead on?
Valerie, I got a comment back here.
I have a question for Eric. So, what research have you done on marine animals, and how does that benefit Rockport and Gloucester?
Wait, repeat the question again, the first part of it.
Oh, what research have you done on marine animals around Rockport and Gloucester?
What have I done?
Yeah.
Oh, I've done lots of stuff with mostly fish. Lots of monitoring of American eels in Rockport, which many of you know about, and assisted many people with counting fish all throughout this part of the state. So lots of the fish that come from the ocean and want to get into our freshwater ponds and streams, which are the ones that everyone here gets to see if they want to. So much of that. A lot of it in the Little River, in West Gloucester, in Millbrook, in Rockport, a little bit over in Ipswich and further up the coast, but a little bit of everything.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for that question. So, thank you for being here. So let me phrase this again. You've heard a tremendous amount this morning. Can you just share with us what reactions you had? What do you think about all of this? Does it resonate with you? Do you take it seriously? And what comes to mind when you internalize and hear from all this? Ruth?
I'm so glad I came today, and I really appreciate the effort you've made to make this happen. So there's been a trend over the last 40 or 50 years to go to lower density and higher zoning regulations around multifamily units and lot size. How do we reverse that? Because I love that you talked about density and how that's a solution or potential solution. How do we convince the people around zoning reform to accommodate what you've suggested?
That's a rhetorical question?
Yeah. Actually, anyone in the audience like to answer that?
I'll let Sarah speak to that, because I think actually Manchester had a pretty good example in terms of how we addressed the 3A controversy.
Sarah Creighton, Chair of Planning Board in Manchester. And my comment was kind of going to be a broader comment, but it's relevant to the question of zoning. And that my broader comment was going to be remind you that in Massachusetts, your FinCom meetings, your planning board meetings, your select board meetings, city council meetings are open. And it's really important to go and listen and understand and hear the variety of interests and priorities that these towns are wrestling with. So the speaker talked about OpEx and CapEx and assessed values. And my husband was on the finance committee for many, many years, so just this morning we were talking about exactly that challenge. So remember that these issues don't happen in a vacuum, and there is not like minds on all of these things. And back to zoning, zoning requires a 2/3 in the towns. I'm not sure how it works in city government, but in the towns it requires a 2/3 vote at town meeting for most zoning changes. And so the solutions end up being a compromise many times between higher density, highest density and lowest density, or most parking spaces and fewest parking spaces, and whatever the issues are. So I really encourage you to go and understand how this government thing works in its imperfections, and then participate. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time to attend, so thanks.
Ellen?
The presentation by Lisa and Erica was excellent, and really second time I've seen it. I'm the person that I will look at something and say, well, now, how can I get involved? What can we do? And also, the cause was ignorance from years ago of dumping at Wingershik. So a lot of stuff goes on in Cape Ann when things are done, and then they backtrack and say, oh, that wasn't a good thing to do, but we don't have money to fix it. So it's just a comment and a frustration. But Eric, and Lisa, how could we be involved? I mean, it's going to take millions of dollars to fix that problem. And as we know, there's not the money there.
Just a quick comment on that, in that there's a good possibility for that particular project, and that's through National Grid settlement with the EPA. There is, Eric, the number is NOAA, with NOAA. And there is a settlement fund that is available for restoration projects around Cape Ann, and certainly the Wingershik project is a high contender.
I'll just add, can I respond to your initial question about, and I think, yeah, there's a lot of pieces to this. I mean, one example I'll give is I do think there has been headway made around density and being more open to multifamily developments, especially in places where rents are spiking, right? Where people are really feeling the increased cost of living. Because I think, there's been research on this. It's made its way into different corners now. I don't know if all of you have heard or read about what's known as the abundance kind of movement now, but there's now just more conversation around this understanding. Building any housing, for example, is going to filter through and help rents for everyone, right? And there's research that shows this, and I'm happy to share the articles that have shown that it doesn't have to be building affordable housing, although that's good too. It's just building any housing, just increasing the supply in any way is going to help reduce rents and prices. And that has started to move the needle in certain places, not everywhere, some places are more stubborn than others. So you could think about just bringing these, pieces of evidence, and you have to think about your constituency and what sources they will trust versus not trust and whatnot. But that seemed to make a difference in lots of different settings, right? Where people started to realize, okay, I believe that this could make a difference. And so knowing that the financial, economic implications of it seemed to move people beyond some of the maybe political or other assumptions that were being made to stop that progress. So just as an example.
Thank you, Rachel. So here's a comment here.
I got the mic. Good. Bud Riss, I'm a Gloucester resident. Lisa, you sort of asked what our impressions are of this morning. Yes. One big one for me is that we got to straighten out the mapping problem, because maps are the fundamental foundation for all the decisions we got to make going forward. And if you think about, the maps I saw this morning shown here are similar to what I've seen in some parts of Gloucester. We have a huge problem. The FEMA maps are based on the history of flooding. They don't assume any sea level rise in the future. The MC firm maps are based on sea level rise plus some changes in wave action. So it just doesn't make any sense that the FEMA map covers a broader area than the MC firm maps. And I think we're going to have this problem in spades if we don't figure out some commonality to use going forward.
Thank you. And I called on you before, yeah? No, wait, can you wait, please?
Oh, I just have a question about how population increase or decrease affects any of these propositions you're making. I mean, are we expecting, and this is out of total naivete, are we expecting our population within the United States to be increasing and specifically maybe around the Northeast? Like, how does that fit into creating more housing? And just curious.
Jesse, your book touches much on that.
Yes and no. Let's talk afterwards because that's a long conversation. It's a good conversation to have, and many places have to prepare for growth. And clearly, you've benefited from the outgrowth of lack of affordability in the city. And there's a lot of climatic and non-climatic dimensions. Climate is just one of many that relate. As others face fiscal stress and pressure and taxes go up and the like, you're going to feel the similar pain, and that competitiveness between in and out of the city will change. But preferences are changing, and that's what matters at the end of the day. Consumers, what they value is changing, and all of this is shaped up and down by climate and non-climatic factors, and that's what you have to keep an eye for.
Well, let me just say that the book North, which I've read a little bit about, is the grand sweep of history that the country is facing, which is a massive migration out of the South, out of the Southwest, out of coastal areas and the flood-prone areas, north and inland. And that means great stresses on both the sending communities that are too risky to live in, to those communities that at least have some safety margin. And that will be a big disruption for the country in coming decades. So another plug for the book.
I think the point that we both were making is to sustain a place and at best and be resilient, you do have to plan for growth, right? And that means not just in terms of the number of people here, but economically, right? So the fishing industry, the waterfront industries, how can you plan for if you want to invest in that, the growth of that, and not just keeping status quo? I mean, this is just, in a sense, the model understanding of how cities sustain themselves, right? You have to be able to, at least create that buffer, right? Should a shock come down, and by planning for growth, you've kind of set yourself up to do that.
So thank you. One more question before we break.
I wanted to go back to the mapping issue. I'm a Manchester resident, and we're really keen to get these conversations going in Manchester. But the mapping doesn't take into account, Eric said there's 2 inches of soil and then there's sand, but for a lot of us, there's 2 inches of soil and then there's granite. And parts of that coast are 20 to 30 feet above sea level. So I think there's the nuance of what's a lot of the Manchester coast is like a fist of granite reaching down into the ocean. And that's going to mean that how sea level rise operates is very helter-skelter. And I think that has to be, before we can talk, we need a map that doesn't mean that half the audience goes, wait a minute, you've got it wrong.
It's true and well put, and what we find in our modeling is that it's not immediately on the foreshore all the time. It's often the secondary and tertiary infrastructures behind. If you're trying to get off island, and if you've only got one causeway or 2 bridges, these systems can collapse, leaving the properties that are quite high and dry on 20 feet of granite vulnerable as well.
And with no power. So thank you all for this morning. I'd like to segue into the afternoon. And mention that Charles and his team have done a great deal of work digging into housing and ecosystems and infrastructure, and the realization that all of this is interlinked. The question was, you know, can we build when we're making the environment degrade? Well, no, we're not going to do that. And what about the quality of our life in communities? So these are big interrelated systems problems that Charles has done and his team have done a lot more work on. This afternoon is really entirely dedicated to the capacity of ourselves and our government and work of government with us to understand and to work together wherever way we can, what other projects like Eric's we can find to start to make some progress at greater resilience. So we have 2 more sessions with 2 lectures and the same sort of open dialogue. And so we have a great lunch from Sugar Magnolias and lots of flyers, and I encourage you to talk to the faculty and talk to your fellow residents and pick up some flyers and really have a good time. We all need food because this is so dense, and this afternoon is dense as well. So we all need to be prepared to think together this afternoon.
Thanks to Sugar Magnolias for lunch. Thanks to Jesse Keenan and Rachel Meltzer. While you're chatting, getting some lunch, I also want to acknowledge we'll be doing 2 other things simultaneously. One is my colleague Dan Dioker from Harvard GSD has a community engagement board game temperature check that he'll be demoing at lunch, and then he'll talk about this afternoon. So thank you, Dan. The Office for Urbanization, Sarah Page, has made an extraordinary video on Cape Ann landscapes that we'll play during the lunch break. So we'll see you at 1.